Welcome to Business Blurred View and the Women Running Businesses podcast. My name is Francisca Lee, and I'll be your host. If this is your first time listening to Women Running Businesses, we are a weekly podcast that brings successful female entrepreneurs in every week to dive deeper into their minds. So, stick around to hear authentic and honest conversations surrounding entrepreneurship and make sure to subscribe to stay in the loop. Today, we have a very special guest, Maya Irvine. Maya is the Chief People Officer at Jive Consulting. She's an MBA student, public speaker, digital content creator, and podcaster. Maya, we're so glad to have you on today's episode.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here and chat with you today.
Of course. So let's start off with talking about your role at Jive Consulting. You're the Chief People Officer, and I've never heard of that position. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what you do in that role?
Absolutely. So as chief people officer, I oversee all things people operations within the company. So that includes hiring, recruitment, retention, company culture, EDI and belonging, company policy, HR, as well as employee benefits.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff on your plate there.
Yes, it's definitely a lot, especially when it's a two-person show, but you get it done.
For sure. So tell me a little bit more about Jive Consulting. What do y'all do?
Absolutely. So Juve is a purpose-driven agency that helps clients better reach Generation Z. And we do that through strategy, implementation, as well as executing on these campaigns that we come up with our clients. And we work with nonprofits. We do pro bono consulting. We work with any brand that is underlying goal is to empower this generation and the folks within the generation is what we currently do at the company.
That's awesome. And Gen Z is definitely a very powerful demographic that you guys are targeting there.
Absolutely. We basically control $143 billion in spending power. So folks that may think that Gen Z isn't the generation to watch are definitely mistaken.
For sure. So how did you end up working at Jive?
Oh, that's a great question. So I went to school. I went to a small liberal arts school where I studied communication arts and psychology. And I swore up and down that I wanted to do public relations for a nonprofit or for an organization that was focused on helping those involved in mass incarceration. I ended up graduating. Long story short, I got into politics and it was my foot in the door, so I thought, and it was absolutely terrible. People who were fighting for these causes behind the scenes that I were encountering didn't really share the values that they were portraying that they actually shared, which was very disheartening for me. So I actually ended up quitting after 2 weeks, and I didn't have another job lined up, and it definitely isn't a decision that I would encourage anybody else to do, but it's something that I had to do for my mental health because the job was genuinely affecting me in a negative way. Like it's funny now, but it was not funny then. I would be on the train and I would cry on my way to work. Like it was that bad for me. So I just quit and I was like, I'll figure it out. And I just went on Indeed and LinkedIn and I applied to every single thing to like come across my screen. And Juve was one of those things. And I honestly looked at it and I was like, this sounds like a scam. A bunch of teenagers running a company. I was like, this definitely sounds fake, but at this point, beggars can't be choosers and I needed a job. So I went to the interview and I ended up loving it. The vibe was just, not to sound redundant, but youthful, and it was like so much energy within the office and a lot of care for the employees. So I was like, I never thought I'd start my career over as a EA or office manager, but I did, and I worked my way up to be Chief People Officer.
Right, that's awesome. And it definitely takes a lot of courage too while you were in your PR career,
right,
to kind of see that you weren't happy and you really needed to, change
right.
that. So what was that like going from PR to now working in HR?
Ooh. So I think the difference is for me in the type of PR that I was doing, I can't speak for every industry. I think for me, the difference was being able to actually put people first. I think with PR, you are telling a story. Most of the story is true, but some of it is going to be blemished a little bit, to be more attractive, to get more clicks on the story, to pitch the story to news outlets. Like, you do have to make it an attractive story, whereas human resources and being in charge of company culture and being, the person that folks go to when they want to advocate for themselves, it's being truthful, transparent, and honest, because without those things, there is really no moving forward to find a solution when brought to your attention. So it's definitely a people first job, which I love because I'm a huge people person. And there's a level of honesty that is in human resources that I personally did not think existed in PR when I was in it.
Right. That's awesome. So in a role that you're in, the day-to-day must be crazy. You must have all sorts of things coming across your plate. But can you tell us a little bit about what your day-to-day or even like a week in your life looks like?
Oh, wow. So do you mean in Juve or just me personally?
Personally works.
I think for me, a day, wow. So I wake up Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I wake up at 7 o'clock and I meet my trainer at the gym. I come home, I get in the shower, I try to get somewhat presentable. I know that it's hard for some folks to get dressed to stay in the house, being that we're in a pandemic. But I still have to get on call, so I try to get somewhat presentable. I work until 6. My day is usually filled with calls. So I usually can't get to the actual work that I need to do for the company. But I work 10 to 6 and then I cook dinner. And then I work out at 7. I do my second workout. And then I start applying for scholarships because I am heading to grad school in the fall. And I am trying my best not to be the one to pay for it or just take out more loans. So I spend my nights applying for scholarships as well as brainstorming content for my podcast, Big Fish Sink or Swim. But we are currently in our off season, so we don't have any episodes coming out. So I'm brainstorming how we can really focus on social media while we're on our off season. And that's basically it. When I'm not working, I'm sort of working on something else.
You're always working.
Or sleeping, because I genuinely enjoy, I'm one of those people that gets 8 hours of sleep every night. I just simply cannot function without it. So why even try to stay up and get things done? So if I'm not working, I'm working or I'm sleeping, essentially.
For sure. And you mentioned that you go back to school, I believe, getting your MBA degree.
Yes.
Why did you decide to go back to school, and how did you choose to get your MBA over, a different master's degree?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I always knew, if we're being completely honest, and I don't know any other way to be, I always knew that I wanted to go back to school off of the simple fact that nobody in my family got their master's or any degree outside of their bachelor's. I am a first generation low income student. So my mother didn't get her bachelor's either. So I did want to go back off of the simple fact of I wanted to be the person in my family, the first person to take that next step. But I told myself I will not go back until I fully knew what I wanted to do. Otherwise, that is just a waste of money to get another piece of paper just to have a big ego. And that didn't make much sense to me. So I started over my career, as I mentioned before, no longer being in public relations, but starting over at Juve. And as I continued to grow within my role at Juve, I started off as office manager and then moved to chief of staff and then chief people officer. I obviously learned a lot through trial and error because we all learn a lot through trial and error, actually, because we're a Gen Z company. A lot of us are 25 or younger. So we've never run a company before. So a lot of us are learning things through trial and error. But it was, in my opinion, I felt like me personally, I got to the point where that was no longer sufficient and that I needed to push myself further if I really wanted to understand how a business or marketing worked. So I decided to take that step and start applying or at least looking for schools that I would be interested in. This was the beginning of the pandemic and I had lots of free time. So I was like, might as well, invest it into pursuing either a hobby or my education. So I actually also started Big Fish over the pandemic. So while I was setting the foundation for that, I just started looking at grad schools and they became more and more intriguing to me and interesting. And I was like, okay, you might as well just take the jump because the longer you think about it, you probably won't do it. So that's how I came up with the idea, and I got started in the pandemic. And being that we're still having a work from home, in-person balance, it's definitely the perfect time for me to think about taking classes. So I applied, I got in, and we'll be starting in the fall.
That's awesome. Do you plan on continuing, working and doing your podcast and everything else while in school?
Yes, that's the plan. I will give you an update in October about how that is going. But that's the plan. The good thing about Juve is that we really don't necessarily care about when you do your work as long as you get your work done and you're meeting deadlines. So we're not sticklers for sticking to a 9 to 5 type vibe as long as folks are getting their work done. So having that flexible schedule definitely helps when it comes to picking what classes I want to take and what times they'll be. It helped me create some type of schedule throughout the next 2 years. The program's only 2 years. So I plan on doing all three. We will see how well it goes.
I feel that. So with Juve, I'm assuming you guys are currently working from home given, the current circumstances.
Correct.
Have you guys always been working remotely, or do you guys have an office space, or how does that kind of work for you guys?
So it was actually prior to the pandemic, it was actually a mixture of the two. So the way that Juve works, we have a group of folks who are our full-time team that essentially are running the company. That includes all of C-suite, our growth team, our internal brand team. Those are the folks that aren't necessarily on the client projects, working to come up with campaign strategies or anything of that nature. We're just the folks behind the scenes keeping the lights on. The folks that are actually being assigned to brands and coming up with those campaign ideas and strategy, those are all remote Gen Zers that work from home, that are located all around the United States, and we have a couple of folks internationally as well. So those folks worked remotely, but the full-time team would come into the office. Now that we are in a pandemic, everybody's essentially working from home. We do have an office in Times Square. That was where our office was located before the pandemic, and we do still have an office in Times Square that folks can go to if they feel comfortable going to, but it is not a requirement, and we do have a max capacity of how many folks are allowed in the office at one time. So it's still a hybrid of working remote, but a lot more folks are obviously working from home because it's just simply safer to do so.
Right, for sure. Do y'all have any plans to go back to the office full time? At least, the core staff?
At this point, no. It's just, we have no desire to push people to go to the office just because. I think people often forget that we are still in a pandemic and we want to force our employees to do anything that they are not comfortable with, especially folks like myself who I'm comfortable going into the office, but I do surround myself with folks who are immunocompromised. So I wouldn't want to, put them in any jeopardy. And we do have folks like that on our team as well. So we just don't want to push any comfort levels or perpetuate this virus in any way, shape, or form. So we're trying to, make sure everybody's safe and comfortable. So not as of right now do we have plans to be in the office 5 days a week or anything like that now.
For sure. That's awesome. I know with applying to internships, one of the big things I'm looking for is are you guys, what are your plans for the summer, guys, in the office? It's kind of crazy hearing what every company's plans are.
Right. No, definitely. Because some companies, I believe it's Twitter, allow their employees to work from home indefinitely because they realize there really is no difference in terms of the quality of work that's being delivered. So definitely companies are handling it in different ways.
Right. So I know Juve works on a lot of influencer marketing campaigns. How does your role as CPO get involved, if at all, in those campaigns?
So that would actually be one of the campaigns that I said that I wouldn't get into the most. Not exactly influencer marketing campaigns. I do, however, quality control all campaigns that involve social impact or underrepresented communities. That's something that I just genuinely like to do. I love marketing, and in the future, my 10-year plan is to be able to specifically help diverse brands in their marketing departments. So being able to do that as chief people officer at Juve is super, super fun. And there are often influencers involved in these projects that I would be quality controlling, or however, I do not like specifically oversee or interact with much of the influencer department.
That makes sense. Yeah. So you also have your own podcast, Big Fish Sink or Swim. What made you want to start a podcast, and can you tell me a little bit more about what you guys talk about on it?
Of course. So I was a comm arts major in college, and that included um, theater, that included rhetoric, that included storytelling, or you can just be a general comm arts major and just take a little bit of classes everywhere, which is what I did. I didn't have a concentration. But one of the things that you can get involved with was radio. So I got involved in radio my freshman year. I ended up working at the station as a music director, which basically entailed reaching out and finding new artists that we could play on the radio. So reaching out to record labels and getting artist merch and getting their CDs mailed in so we could play it on the station. So I did that for 2 to 3 years. And then I became office manager or radio station manager, in which I was the supervisor in the radio station doing a lot more managerial tasks. But one of the things that was a requirement in order to work at the station was you had to have a show on the station. So whether I wanted one or not, I had to have one to keep my job. So I started it and I loved it. So when I graduated, something that I wanted to keep up because I developed the skills to like edit my podcast, and I knew where to post it, and I knew the resources. So I was like, this is definitely something I can do in my house on my bed. But I didn't want to do it alone. And I could not think of anybody to do it with me, even though I developed so many friendships within my major that I knew would share the same interest and passion. And then one day it just clicked in my head. I was like, oh my God, I have a best friend who at the time wasn't employed. Now she's being contracted. Carmen's doing amazing things for brands right now on social media. But at the time, she just actually came home off of Fulbright because they sent everybody home because of the pandemic. So she had lots of free time. And I was like, wait, Carmen, do you want to do this thing together and develop a podcast? And she was like, wait, absolutely. So I completely scrapped the idea that I had been working on for an entire year, just procrastinating because I knew I didn't want to do it by myself. And me and Carmen developed this brand and what it would stand for over the summer, and released our first episode early September. But basically, Big Fish Sink or Swim is just about Black women finding themselves and talking about the things that we're never allowed to talk about at the forefront, which includes a lot of things. It includes sexuality. It includes not knowing what you want to do with your life and that being okay, but nobody ever wants to talk about that. That includes trying to figure out, how to push back on your boss because nobody has taught you that, and there are just certain things that you won't stand for. It includes so many things, but I think the main thing that I want people to know is that Big Fish is for and by Black women, and that's the umbrella that we stand under, because there's so many things that falls under what's for Black women that needs to be discussed at the forefront.
Right, that's awesome. That's really driving some really important conversations, especially in this day and age.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So you were also recently featured by Yahoo as a top Black Gen Z creative. Congrats. That must have been a super cool accomplishment. How did that happen?
That is a great question. So Yahoo has this campaign and an additional a branding site called In the Know, in which they highlight young millennials, late Gen Zers about the work that they're doing. So they contacted me and was like, hey, we previously did a video and profile for Shina, who is our chief marketing officer at Juve, and we were just on your website, want to do one on you too. And I was like, great. So we actually did a In the Know video profile, which was just simply talking about all the things that I was working on, and that was last year. And then, like a month ago, 2 months ago, I guess now, I get like a message in my my workplace, which is like our Slack at Juve, saying that I was featured in Yahoo as one of the top Black creatives. And I was like, what? So quite frankly, I'm not sure how I got featured, because I did not know that that feature was happening at all. But I did have a previous conversation with Yahoo, just simply talking about all the things I was working on at the time. I was also, while working at Jive, I was also doing social media for Black-owned brands in New York. One podcast called Bonnets and Durags, and another brand called the Cafe Open Mic, which allowed Black creatives to come in and perform, and just provide a safe space for creatives. So I was doing social media for them at the time. And they just simply wanted to just talk about all the things that I was doing. That turned into another feature of me being featured as one of the top Black creatives, which was absolutely amazing. I could not believe that that had happened.
That's awesome. Sometimes, like, the most, like, amazing things happen out of, just one interview or something like that.
Right, exactly.
And of course, since we are the Women Running Businesses podcast, we have to talk about being a woman in business. What are some of the struggles that you've had to face or overcome, especially in a leadership role?
I think a lot of the struggles that I overcome actually has to do more with the people that I've encountered outside of the company rather than inside of the company. I think that fundamentally, I know that folks are different, but fundamentally, I think that Gen Z has different set of values and expects different things from their work environment than previous generations. And I think that that's safe to say because every generation is different and there are fundamental things that each generation thought or looked for in certain traditions. And I think that Gen Z specifically values feeling empowered and having a voice. And I don't know if women having a voice in business is something that previous generations are used to. So I think that sometimes when I'm interacting with external folks, like being in contact with potential clients or looking for potential sponsors or partnerships for impact or whatever the case may be, I often find myself in conversations where I feel like I'm not being heard, I'm being talked over, I'm not being listened to, assumptions are being made. It has come from a variety of people. It has come from other women. It has come from men. And I don't even think that they are aware that they're doing it, to be honest. I don't think that it's always a malicious thing. But it is something that I've noticed that I hate and that I found ways to make sure it does not happen. So making sure that I repeat what I'm saying. So when I'm interrupted, I repeat what I said. And I said I wanted to repeat it because it sounds like nobody heard me. It sounds like nobody was listening. And I also was being interrupted. So I just wanted to repeat to make sure that everybody heard me. So just finding my way, different ways to make my voice feel heard in conversations is super important to me. And I'm sure that other women in business have to, navigate those same waters.
Right, for sure. Definitely in the workplace, the traditional type, there's definitely a lot of microaggressions that occur in, just daily conversations. So figuring out how to navigate those conversations is really important, especially for people who are, transitioning out of college, just now entering the workforce. Exactly. So I think I really like what you said about that.
Exactly, no, definitely.
Yeah. And have you ever faced imposter syndrome? And how do you deal with that if you
have?
Definitely.
I still face it, to be honest. I think it was the worst after I left my previous position. I felt so inadequate to do anything, literally anything. I second guessed my ability to do every single thing. When I got to Juve, that feeling carried over. And it carried over for things that it should not have. I remember, for example, my boss at the time gave me a well-written paragraph and was like, hey, can you send this paragraph to these people on LinkedIn? And that's all I had to do. And the anxiety that I had doing that task was like absolutely insane. But that imposter syndrome has not left me. Now running a vertical, I'm being a Figley student and my mom not going to college or not having a bachelor's degree. She ended up going back, but not having a bachelor's degree. There are a lot of things about running a business I simply do not know, would have never thought of. I've never had to be somebody's direct manager. So I'm constantly second guessing my ability to do this, even my ability to go to grad school. Once I got in, I was like, oh crap, like, can I actually do this? And I still have my reservations as I'm talking to you now. But I think the best way that I've learned to deal with it is if I truly wasn't doing a good job or even a good enough job, I would not be here. They wouldn't ask my opinion on things. They wouldn't ask me to do more things. Uh, Having that simple framework keeps me grounded in the moment, because that is just the truth. If somebody else could be doing this work, they would be doing this work. So I am here for a reason. I just try to remember that.
For sure. That's such an important thing to
Yeah.
remember. So, especially with the pandemic and the current political environment, how has your role as a CPO and as an HR professional shifted?
How has it shifted? I don't think that it's shifted much. I think that the fundamental goal of my role is to make sure that folks can show up to work as their full selves and feel comfortable doing so. One of the fundamental goals of my role. And I think that with the civil unrest that I don't want to say that was happening over the summer because it was happening far beyond the summer, but was being
Right.
spotlighted this summer, just enforced how important that was. Because I think what a lot of people talked about this summer, a lot of people of color, was this feeling of having to deal with being Black, because I am Black, the feeling of dealing with being Black in this world and having that weigh on us, and then expect to come into work the next day and act like we're okay and act like we're not traumatized and act like we're not watching Black people being murdered on social media. And I think my role didn't change, but I think the priorities of my role changed. It was no longer about hiring and recruitment and retention, but it was more so about supporting our employees in that very moment that needed support. We had employees and contractors that were going to protest that we could be providing resources for. We have folks that had risked themselves getting arrested and that have been arrested that we can be provided resources for during these protests. So I don't think that my role shifted, but my priority shifted. Nobody cares about hiring when this is happening. It is strictly about the people and making sure that they feel heard and that they have resources.
Right, for sure. And I think that really speaks testament to the work culture that Juve kind of
Right.
cultivates. So, what's a piece of advice that you would give someone that's wanting to, eventually maybe work in an environment like Juve, a Gen Z powered type company?
What's one piece of advice I would give? I would ask a question to yourself, because this is something that I never thought about assisting in running a business. It was never something that crossed my mind. And to be quite frank, I don't know if it's something that I would continue to do in the next 10 years. My 10-year goal is not necessarily to run a business or own a business. And the reason being is because while doing this, and I sort of got into this role by coincidence or by accident or by happen chance or whatever. Do you want to be responsible for people's livelihood and for people's feelings and emotions? And I don't think that that's a chief people officer question. I think that that's genuinely a business question, because you have to remember that your decisions trickle down and affect so many people and so many people's lives, from literally anything, the small financial decision to what your company stands for. Every single thing matters. There is not one detail that does not matter. And you are in charge of that. And that is a lot of responsibility. And I don't think folks think about owning a business in that way. But I do think that, and maybe that's because the goals of businesses and the visions and missions of businesses weren't the same as they are now, where there has to be an impact part of your business. Like that is important, and that is what Gen Z values. What are you doing for your consumer? What are you doing for the people outside of providing product and taking money? And I think that that's super important. I think that that's a value that Gen Z definitely looks for. So maybe this is a question that most Gen Zers are thinking about possibly, but I would definitely think about, do you feel comfortable enough and grounded enough to be responsible for people in a variety of ways? And if the answer is yes, then continue on with your business idea. But I think people can often lose that or lose vision of that when coming up with a business.
For sure. And that's some great advice, especially if you think about as, kids are getting out of college. And I think that is a great place to end this episode. Maya, thank you so much for coming on here today and sharing your experiences. For our listeners, make sure to tune back in next week for a new episode of Women Running Businesses.